A bit of, we'll start with brief intros. I'm Mike Sankey. I am the global industry leader for healthcare and life sciences at Databricks. And Databricks is a technology company focused on this end-to-end platform for data management and machine learning and AI. I've been at Databricks a little over a year, and really my focus there has been how do we extend this platform for industry-specific use cases and applications, including real-world evidence, where we've developed with partners things like natural language processing pipelines for adverse event detection. We look at data lineage and model lineage as critical for reproducibility, for research regulatory grade type evidence. And prior to Databricks, I was leading the real-world data and analytics business at Optum. So this area is definitely a passion of mine. So with that, maybe we can just, again, do some brief intros with the other panelists. Would just love to hear, share with the audience brief bio, where you're coming from, where you sit within the organization, and what you hope to bring to the dialogue today. So maybe people are joining. I know many people just listened to Gregor, but Greg, would you mind starting?
Yes, sure. My name is Greg Mercier. I'm from France, Montpellier. I'm a physician by training, and my current position is head of the data science unit at Montpellier University Hospital. It's actually all about developing the hospital data warehouse and the reuse of this data in terms of research and innovation development. Thanks.
Great. Christophe, do you want to go next?
Yes, hi everyone. So I'm Christophe Dufour. I'm head for France, AstraZeneca France, for data and digital solutions for the whole marketing company and also the R&D in France, so meaning commercial, medical, market access, and clinical trials. And my main focus, my main challenge today is how we can use data, and especially real-world evidence data, to be able to take decision, to help in recruitment, to help also in medical. You mentioned adverse detection, scientific knowledge, all these kind of thing, and also to help commercial teams to know, to understand better the customer and patient pathway. So basically the data become the oil of the company. So we try to base all our decision based on that. So I think this is the question today we want to address together.
That's great. And Bagmeet, would you go?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Machine, for the opportunity. My name is Bagmeet Vera. I am Senior Manager Data Science in Amgen. And in Amgen, I'm working closely with digital health, and I'm reporting within the observational research organization. So so I have been working on generating real-world evidence and predictive modeling to support patients in terms of medical adherence, for example, in terms of understanding risk for patients, and also work with certain external external companies, sometimes startups on their digital platforms, and understanding the data we can get from them and how we could best use those in the field. So yeah, very happy to be here and share my views on the journey in Amgen and outside Amgen on real-world evidence generation.
That's great. Yeah, and one of the things I love about like this topic and this panel is already brought together, obviously pharma representation, but Greg, with you coming in, really representing the health system as well, because that is where the data is generated for real world evidence. So maybe we can start, I know we had a sort of prep conversation for this. And one of the things we were talking about were some of the most interesting use cases you've seen in your organization around real world evidence. And we were talking about some areas like measuring the success of CAR T therapy and using RWD for clinical trial design. So maybe you each could spend 2 to 3 minutes and just share one of the most interesting applications you've seen for RWE over the last year or so. And we'll go in reverse order this time. So Bagmeet, we'll start with you.
Sure. there are a number of things one can do in the development field. For example, in the development of drugs, one could look at how to use real world evidence to then inform us better to design clinical trials. So that's one of the things which always benefits from understanding whether the right patient cohort or the right size of the patient cohort will be able to be recruited within the given amount of time. How much time would you really need to collect the data to establish the benchmarks or to calculate the statistics that let you know whether the clinical trial did work, whether you were able to reach your endpoints properly. So that's one aspect for sure, which does help a lot. Look at historical data, both clinical and real world, to understand the patient's population in the different geographies you're talking about. And that's one example. One could also look
And
at.
just sorry to interject. Just in that area, do you have any like recommendations for the audience here? Are there certain areas where you've seen that be more successful? Is like cardiology more successful than oncology, or really across the board, across geographies, you're seeing successful application?
Well, there could be a wide range of applications where this is important, but in certain niche areas where you're looking at maybe rare diseases, then it becomes even more important to understand whether you will be able to meet all the requirements for the clinical trials before even trying to launch it. So that's one of the areas where this is very useful, I would believe.
Great.
Right. Yeah. And then looking at the other side, one could also look at efficacy after drugs have been released to the market. After a few years of data could be collected, one can then go back and see whether the target population is actually getting, first of all, the care or the medications that they were supposed to, and what has been the actual effect in the real world. So that's sort of the other side of the story, right? One is pre-release and another is post-release of the drug and everything. So yeah, I think both of these do gain a lot from real-world evidence to convince yourself that things are actually working the way they should or not. And then you can, of course, change some things and understand how to make it better.
Great, thank you. Christoph, would you like to share next?
Yeah, just not to repeat everything Bagmit has said, I will focus on other aspects. First aspect today is on clinical trial recruitment. I mean, for France and some countries in Europe, we start to use RWE, but also open data to be able to identify new centers because we need to multiply by 2 or 10, depending the pathology, the recruitment. And today we cannot do it with the data we already know. So we need to rely on new data sources to be able to identify new patients. So this is a new challenge started last year where we need to leverage this data. After the second part, and of course, due to my position, I am in early access and post-launch, we have a lot of market access use cases. Again, we rely on RWE to measure the efficiency of our medicine, to identify what will be the impact of a treatment. But also, it's quite new. We try to put quality of life information inside RWE to be able to get more information. So that means we need to use RWE, but also digital solutions to be able to collect new data, which are not today collected by the system. And the second kind of data we are using our claims data. In France, we have the chance to have only one payer. So we have basically 15 million users in one database. So the idea is to connect both data sources to be able to have more accurate information and to be more precise. And one day to be able to work with the payer based on indicators we have together. The third part is medical, of course. The scientific knowledge we have through RWE is very, very important. And we try also to work with other countries to be able to collect and to share between countries the scientific knowledge. And the last one is around commercial. commercial did not have access to RWE, and they don't have access directly to RWE. But what we try to do is to be able to collect some key information, aggregated data, to be able to take decision for our field forces or for specific, I would say, purposes, to be able for commercial to be more efficient, because we think that we will move more on how we can bring value to an HCP or to the healthcare ecosystem. So that means we need to understand basically what is the impact of one pathology, and the medicine is not enough. So we need to understand how the treatment is done to be able to be more impactful. So all across our units, we need to leverage this data.
That's great. I want to just ask a question on, you mentioned digital solutions. I know that came up in the introductions as well. Like, where have you seen success in some of these new emerging digital solutions in collecting complementary data?
Yeah, sure. Two kinds of projects. For example, one project we had for MDM, so multidisciplinary meetings, the ability to have a solution to help the HCP to work together, allow us also to collect data and to be able to have the data we didn't have before. This is one solution. One other idea is solution we give to the patient to follow a treatment, for example. So we ask question, how does he feel? What are the side effects or adverse events or all this kind of thing? And the solution is connected also to his HCP to be able to have a follow by the HCP of the patient. And all the data collected here, we can call it RWE, because as an HCP is in the field, in place, the data we collect is very, very good data. We can use it to work with HTA, for example.
Yeah, that's great. And Greg, how about you? Sitting, in a health system, some interesting, probably overlap in terms of both you and Christophe are working in France, access to the claims data, bringing the different sources together. What have you seen from your perspective of, the most interesting use case over the last year or so?
Yes, so two things. The first one is that there is a trend at the national, but also at the European level, towards harmonization of all hospital data warehouses, because obviously hospital warehouses are really, rich and really comprehensive in terms of data. But you might want, and usually you want to have a multi-center hospital data warehouse. And so that's actually the whole point about using international data standards such as OMOP. So it's not the case, to be honest, today, but my big hope is that within probably 2 or 3 years, we're going to see an increasing number of hospitals in France, but also in Europe, again, sharing the same sort of data, using the same data model and also data standards. And so that will be incredibly powerful in terms of analyzing RWE generated in hospitals. So that's the first point, which I hope. And then the second point, I just wanted to share a very interesting study that we conducted in the hospital, and I think it's closely linked to what Christophe just explained. So we were interested, it's a partnership between the hospital and 2 pharmaceutical companies. So it's about access to innovation. And it's actually about how we can use national claims data to understand any gaps, any disparities in terms of access to innovations. And we specifically focused on CAR T cells for non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So very briefly, really tremendously effective treatment, very costly too, and it has to be actually implemented in a very small number of reference centers. And so there is, from the patient perspective, there is the question, which is, if you are eligible to the treatment, what is the probability that you actually receive the treatment? And from the healthcare system perspective, there is the question of how many reference centers do we need, and where should they be located in the country? And from the industry perspective, I think it's a market access treatment, because if some eligible patients cannot access to the treatments, it's just an unmet need. And so if you are able to identify and then to target these areas, it's really powerful. And so we actually, we worked with a board of hematologists, and so we were able to identify patients who are eligible to this treatment using the national claims database that Christophe mentioned before. And then we also were able to see which one of those patients actually received the innovation, the CAR T cells. And so we showed a very interesting but also very concerning result, which is that the further, as a patient, the further you live from the reference center in terms of geography, in terms of time, then the lower the probability you actually receive the treatment. Of course, we adjusted on age and severity and comorbidity and so on, which means that probably we should, and that's the conclusion of the hematologist, we should work more actively and actually help those patients to be included in the right clinical pathway so that they ultimately receive the treatment. So it's just an example, but I think it's really interesting because there is value to the providers, there is value to the pharmaceutical industry, and also there is value to the patients using the national claims database. So that's, I think, the type of project that are going to be implemented in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Two things that I want to follow up on there. One is, how would you recommend, I mean, there's a lot of interest in the pharma community to engage with health systems, not only in France, but globally. Do you have any recommendations, best practices? What do you look for in a partnership with a pharma organization? And how do you operationalize that?
So I think there are several ways to, of course, to work with a hospital or with a system. If you think about the last example I explained, it's it's actually very easy. You just have to contact the right team within the hospital, and then you have access to the data through the hospital, and also you have access to the clinical expertise, which usually comes with the data. But then if it's about using local data from the hospital warehouse, I think probably you need to have a multi-center approach, because I guess that you don't want to talk to all French hospitals. It's just not feasible. So, and I think that's why we have to share, because you have to identify probably a small number of leading hospitals, having a data warehouse, sharing the same data structure and format. And I agree that's the complexity of the process, but things should be improving in the very near future.
Great. Then the second area, you were talking about sort of distance from the center and likelihood of getting treatment and how you think about these care pathways. And I want to introduce our final panelist here. Thanks for joining. And I know one of the things you want to talk about was decentralized trials. And I think that fits into like some of these themes around like distance from the center. How are you optimizing not only clinical trial recruitment and design, but ultimately some of these care pathways? So if you won't mind, could you introduce yourself, the organization you're with, and then maybe share a little bit about your thoughts on decentralized trials?
Definitely. First of all, I would like to apologize for the late joining because I was somehow thinking it is late in a different time zone. So apology for that. And thank you for adding me. Myself, Bhupati Allegri Swami. I work with Boehringer Ingelheim as a clinical trial manager and have a total of 16 years of experience in this pharmaceutical industry, work with different pharma and CROs. But the last couple of years, I've been mainly working on the DCTs and the artificial intelligence, how it can be incorporated within the DCT models and how we can enhance this traditional clinical trial way. So DCTs, definitely it is just changing across the globe, and there are chances of converting the traditional way of doing clinical trials into a modern way of more digitalization or more patient-centric way of doing it. So the main point is that how best we are doing it, because certain countries where they have a regulatory and ethics pathway, so where the pharma companies or the CROs can perform the DCT models much more easier, where the countries, they don't have regulatory body support, so still it is lay behind. And also the budget and the cost and designing the study is also another challenges, where they should have an idea of how to perform the DCTs and how to get the job, or how the patients are being accepting this kind of a new way doing the clinical trials. So that is also being a challenge at the moment. However, it has been seeing a good transformation at certain countries like US, Canada, or US and other part of the Europe. So it has been a promising way of conducting these clinical trials in the future, or currently they're doing. So the main thing is the shortening of the clinical trial process and increases the success rate of the clinical trial, and making patient-centric, making at the comfort zone of the patient. They can participate in a clinical trial, no boundaries, like patients can join it from the different part of the world, as long as they have access to the internet. So these are the most advantages, and it's been seen in current trend, and it is going to be seen more in other trials. And before it, or currently with majorly on the rat clinical trials or rare disease. So I would say moving forward, or we are also started working with the oncology trials and other very important trials where it can enhance the clinical trial process and benefit the patient and the sponsors or CRO.
That's great.
Thank you.
I want to turn to, one of the themes that came up when we were doing the prep for this was around trust, governance, data access, data management. Obviously, everything we're doing here depends on data. Most of it, of course, collected in the real world through routine clinical practice or emerging digital solutions, as we touched on briefly. And this is in some ways, it's a global challenge. There's challenges not only in standardizing data, and we mentioned OMOP as one of those analytic data models, but also sharing data, governing data across countries. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about, acknowledgement of the challenges, but perhaps more importantly, what solutions are you seeing put in place effectively? How is technology potentially solving some of these challenges? Do you have any recommendations for the audience here in terms of how they think about collecting and sharing data, particularly across borders? And maybe we'll go back to Bagmeet if you want to start us off again.
Sure. This time, even though I'm from Amgen, which is a BioPharma company, I will talk from the perspective of a patient, because I think that's very critical as well. And in the end, patients are sort of the center in every clinical trial, in every program. So when we talk about sort of collecting digital data through devices and all other means, we want to not only catch the most savvy sort of group of people who work with mobile phones, who are very excited to try new technologies, but we also want to get sort of a good cross section across the population, right? The different age groups, the different demographics, different ethnicities, and everything, which are representative of the population, right? And the biggest hurdle to that might be a number of things. I mean, one is the right kind of information and transparency in what is going to be collected, how it is going to be used, and that is sometimes not looked upon with a lot of trust. Yeah, and therefore a lot has to be maybe done to make sure that there is complete transparency in what will be done, and there will be no modifications, or let's say no substantial modification in how the data will be used later on. Yeah, because then that will erode the trust, and the future experiments will always hurt from that. And secondly, I think patients should also feel like they have a bit of ownership, or at least ownership of their data, and they get back something which is relevant and useful for them personally, right? So, for example, if EMR data is being collected, then the patient should also have access to exactly the same data that is being collected from their patient history. Yeah, if some monitoring data from their sleep or pattern, or from their activity pattern, or anything else is being collected, something very specific to a clinical trial, then I'm sure patient will like it when they are able to get summary information about their own data, what was collected from them, how does that compare with, let's say, the cohort of patients on an average, and when the results are then sort of assessed and published, the patient should also get a good view of that. Yeah, and that way is something, I mean, they feel that they're contributing to something which is helping a wider public. They're getting back insights and information on themselves, and that gets them more involved. So I think, yeah, increasing transparency and sharing the information, not just what you're collecting, but what you do with it, what are the conclusions you draw from it, will go a long way to sort of bridge that gap.
Yeah, appreciate those comments, certainly on sharing back with the patient, being transparent about how their data is being used. Christoph, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, actually, we have two main challenges today. One is accessing the data, and Gregor mentioned that the value is to have multiple centers. So today, when you want to work with multiple centers, you have a problem of standards, of course, but it's not the biggest problem for us. The biggest problem is a legal problem. How do we collect the data? How do we manage patient consent? In addition of that, if you want to use claims data, you have very strict regulation on the use cases and KPI you want to measure. So all this framework, legal framework, is quite very, very complex and takes up to 1 or 2 years to start a complex study, just based on the legal problems. And the second one is the trust. So the trust today is how we can prove that the KPIs, the indicator we have calculated when you work with AI, how the model has been built. So everything you need to explain to HTA or to your payer is very, very important. And we have done in France a consortium with public and private actors to be able to tackle that. So we work with an independent actor to be able to say that everyone in the room has played with the rules. And in terms of technology, we use blockchain, so we can prove from everything from end to end where the data come from, how it has been modified, who has modified the data. So when you want to audit all the indicators, all the models, you can do that. So the trust is done through an independent actor and technology.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That you know, certainly I've heard a lot of emerging applications in blockchain in the pharma industry, everything from distribution now, of course, RWE. Greg, would you like to go next? I think we have about 90 seconds each for each of our panelists.
Yes, sure. So 2 words. I think that there is a growing number of data ethics labels or certifications. So that's probably a good way to move forward. And the second word is data trusts. So I've never been part of any of them, but my understanding is that it's a way to collectively make decisions about what we do with the data. And so it's having all stakeholders on board, including patients or citizens, and then being very transparent about what we do with the data, what we don't want to do with the data. So probably developing data trusts dedicated to healthcare would be a good option.
Yeah, thank you. Bhupati, you have the last word here. Bring us home.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. The main point, what I think is that conversion of the unstructured data to structured data. So the challenging is that because when we do a clinical trial globally and we want the data from across the globe to make the drug to be marketed more promising. So the structured data is more of used for any of the analytical purpose, but we are very limited. And for example, within the AI, we have to use the structured data, and it is very limited for any algorithm prediction. So we have to use the data which is from just unstructured one. So that's a part where the electronic health records can't be completely used. So where we have to go for the paper notes, and there are softwares now available for converting the paper notes, capture the important information and transform to an structured notes or data for the algorithm. So this is where something which is way ahead we are looking into. And regarding the trust, it's still being challenged. Who performs and how they perform, it is a matter. And definitely, like with this, as Christopher mentioned, the blockchains and the AI on the more advanced security patches are now up, and we have to trust on that lines.
Yeah, that's great. Well, appreciate all of you joining. It's great to hear not only your thoughts, but also what your organizations are doing, certainly on the cutting edge here. So thank